typically we don't let anybody.
Stepping in for at-large.
So I said if somebody did.
Somebody who did.
Well, the problem,
Okay.
the problem is now that
I didn't do it.
people come down here for like,
It's just here.
Yeah.
So,
So just make sure that when I pull up Chrome, it's on our account, right?
so I guess that's another step we're gonna have to add to the checklist.
Okay, we can do this.
So make sure that we're still good to go.
So my grandma was right, you were offline,
For that account, we were online, but,
that's the one you do.
right.
Grandma's always proud to see her grandson on council meetings.
You need to call her more.
I know, make some good food. Keep her happy.
Not going.
Yeah, seen it, everything.
There it goes.
I typically get notified of
Did
it.
you already say who's gonna do Carlos'
Are you getting it?
piece of legislation?
You got it.
Huh?
She's second on
I'm second. Right, but I'm saying her first piece of legislation.
Thank you.
All right.
Great piece of advice. That's what I like.
Who's gonna do the first one? What's that? Who's gonna do the first one? I don't know. It's over there. Oh.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. We'll get through it.
All right.
All right, so we good?
Yeah, we're good.
Believe so.
Good to go. Okay. Okay, this is a regular legislative meeting of the Barberton City Council. Today is Monday, December 21st, 2020. It is 7:08 p.m. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance, followed by the invocation of Mr. Green. Pledge allegiance
to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Dear Lord, provide us protection and guidance. Please give us the ability to make the best decisions for the greater good of our city. Show mercy and provide hope for our community and our country in times of this crisis. Provide protection for our first responders as they provide us 24-hour overwatch. Thank you for instilling compassion in all our businesses and individuals throughout our community. And helping donate or by donating and sponsoring families for the holidays. And always remember the 22. Yeah.
Okay, roll call. Mrs. Angela.
Here.
Mrs. Coburn.
Here.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mrs. Fry.
Here.
Mr. Greer.
Here.
Mr. Griffin.
Here.
Mr. Heidick.
Here.
And Mr. Taylor.
Here.
Okay. Council Rule 103 states the regular and committee of the whole meetings shall be at 7:30 p.m. Since we are starting earlier than this, we will need to invoke Council Rule 702. Mr. Heidick.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that we invoke 702 to suspend 103. Sorry.
That's okay. Thank you. And Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mr. Heidick's motion.
Okay. Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Heidick and seconded by Mrs. Fry to invoke Council Rule 702 to suspend Council Rule 103. Are there any remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay. There are no minutes at this time. Petitions and claims, there are none. Matters requested have been passed out. Citizens addressing council, there is one letter right here. This is, I just received this today, so it goes like this. Let me tell you about Mike Kenyon. He was couch surfing when we met. He has a fixed income and it is a small amount. He's a nice man, doesn't drink or dope, and struggles with hearing problems. He'd like to have a girlfriend, but it's not easy for him to converse because it's hard for him to follow a conversation. And because he doesn't hear well, he can't drive a car, ride a bike in traffic, etc. It's difficult for him to get to the store, keep appointments, and so on. Even if he did walk the distance to the grocery on the day free of rain and snow, he can only carry so much home. I began taking him to the local food bank last year and since the pandemic, Viva Proxy. I've been taking groceries to his house. We communicate by writing to each other. One time I noticed him moving the sheet of paper back and forth. Then he picked up a pair of bent up drugstore readers and was able to work out my handwriting. I made an appointment for him with my eye doctor and picked up the tab on what his insurance didn't pay. My neighbors gave him a couple of pairs of shoes after they noticed him walking in the yard in socks. With Kmart on, getting footwear is difficult. He's not my only tenant in town who struggles with these things we take for granted, and I am not the only landlord who tries to look out for their renters. There's a waitress who has no income when she has to take a sick day. Her landlords pay her water bill on these occasions. When the electric went out on the east side there, a landlord who went through Rockies for ice so renters could keep their food. There's a landlord who was homegoing transport for the tenants after a cardiac event, and one who delivered hand sanitizer at the onset of the pandemic. There is a landlord who makes sure his amputee tenants always has food. We are constantly overcompensating for our inept city leadership. From water in our basement, car repairs because of chuck holes ate the tie rod, roads are supposed to be taken care of by general funds, but empty coffers, so passed an additional road tax and not one lick of paving done this year. But the city would draw and quarter me if I didn't make mine repairs. And picking up the litter and mowing the empty lot next door. We do our part. We evict drug users, repair damages from vandals, and bring sad houses back to life. We contribute to local charities and provide a generous tax base. While our city lets jobs leave town, from Ryder Dairy, Gardner Pie, and Cosmo Proof out of the plaza. We employ carpenters and buy shingles. We are the solution, not the problem. Our leaders have let our city sink into blight, not us. We aren't wealthy. Many of us are small landlords. We have expenses, and it only takes a few holes in the drywall and a vanished refrigerator to trip up the budget. But when we do end the year with a coin in our pocket, we'd rather get some new gravel for the driveway or put some groceries in one of the blessing boxes around town than fund some bureaucratic futility that will further impoverish our community rather than strengthen it. Our money's under our control are dispersed efficiently. But regardless of whether you agree with the landlord-tenant perspective, whether you think our arguments have merit, the fact is this legislation is unpopular. It was unpalatable in 2009, and the community still looks as if without favor. Council is supposed to act as a voice of the citizens. We do not want this legislation, so let's deny it. Let's focus instead on supporting those who are working to enhance the community and being an instrument of good to our neighborhoods. Respectfully, Susan Frybonic. I think that's how you pronounce it. That's the only letter for the citizens I have. Okay. First reading of ordinance and resolutions. Ordinance number 159, 2020, presented by Mrs. DeBevick, titled Enter into Contract, Law Department, Defender's Office of Summit County. An ordinance authorizing the law director to enter into a one-year contract with the Legal Defender's Office of Summit County to provide legal representation to indigent persons in the amount of $170 per case and declaring an emergency. Mr. Greer, motion to suspend.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you, and Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second Mr. Greer's motion on suspension.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mr. Greer and seconded by Mr. Griffin to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 159-2020.
Thank you. And Mr. Griffin.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to second the motion on adoption on ordinance number 159-2020.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Greer and seconded by Mr. Griffin to adopt ordinance number 159-2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
And Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Ordinance number 160-2020, presented by Mrs. Fry, title Appropriation, Fire Department. An ordinance appropriating $2,846.43 from the unappropriated item of the general fund to the fire department's operating budget and declaring an emergency. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mrs. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin, excuse me. Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
And Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Okay, motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 160-2020.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance number 160-2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
And Mrs. Beck. Ordinance number 161-2020. Ordinance presented by Mr. Greer, titled Authorized Payment, City of Akron, an ordinance authorizing payment in the amount of $15,179.03 to the City of Akron for the final project construction costs performed within the Barberton city limits on West State Street and declaring an emergency. Motion to suspend, Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
Thank you. And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Greer and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mr. Jaber.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 161-2020.
Thank you, and Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Greer, second by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance number 161, 2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Fry. Mrs. Fry, excuse me.
Yes.
Mrs. Golden.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mr. Jader.
Yes.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay. Ordinance number 162, 2020, presented by Mr. Greer, titled Enter into Contract with GPD Group. An ordinance authorizing the mayor to enter a contract with GPD Group, Inc., GPD, for general professional engineering services, including but not limited to permissive and residential street resurfacing and programs, infrastructure improvement, design and management, street crack sealing, street stripping, and miscellaneous engineering management services, and declaring it emergency. Motion to suspend, Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rules required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Greer and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mr. Jader.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. Covert.
Yes.
And Mrs. DeBevick. Motion to adopt, Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 162-2020.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second that motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mr. Greer, second by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance 162, 2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mrs. DeBevick. Mrs. Covert.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Jader.
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
And Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Ordinance number 163, 2020, presented by Mrs. Fry, titled Year-End Appropriations Amendments. An ordinance modifying appropriations within certain departments and funds in order to cover expenditures to the end of the fiscal year and declaring an emergency. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. A motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mrs. Covert.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mr. Jader.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
And Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Motion to adopt, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 163-2020.
And Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to adopt.
Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and seconded by Mrs. Angeloff to adopt ordinance 163, 2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mr. Jader.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
And Mrs. Covert.
Yes.
Ordinance number 164, 2020, presented by Mrs. Fry, titled 2021 Temporary Budget. An ordinance adopting the temporary budget for various funds of the city of Barberton for the period between January 1st, 2021, and providing for the administration thereof and declaring an emergency. Motion to suspend, Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that the rule as required by section 5.10 of the Barberton City Charter be suspended.
And Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will second the motion to suspend.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry and second by Mrs. Angeloff to suspend the rule as required by section 5.1 of the Barberton City Charter. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on suspension. Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mr. Heidick.
Yes.
Mr. Jagan.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
And Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Motion to adopt. Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move for the adoption of ordinance number 164-2020.
Thank you, Mrs. Angeloff.
This is the city council.
What is it?
Barberton City Council. So I can come out.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to adopt.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Fry, second by Mrs. Angela, to adopt ordinance number 164, 2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mrs. Cover.
Yes.
Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mr. Jagan.
Yes.
Mr. Height.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
And Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Okay. At the end of first reading. Second reading of ordinances and resolution, there are none. Third reading of ordinances and resolution. Ordinance number 147, 2020, presented by Mrs. Angeloff, titled Amending Barberton Codified Ordinance, Chapter 670, Trees, Weeds, and Grass, Chapter 1422, Registration in General, and Chapter 1444, Permits and Fees. An ordinance amending Section 670.02, Removal of Weeds by Owner or Occupant, 5 days notice. Ordinance number 49, 2013, Section 1422.04, Registration Fees Insurance. Ordinance number 32, 2011, and Section 1444.15, General Permit Fees. Ordinance number 146, 16. Motion to adopt. Mrs. Angela.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that ordinance number 147, 2020 be adopted as presented.
And Mrs. Coder.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion for adoption of ordinance number 147, 2020 as presented.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff, second by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance 147, 2020. Are there any remarks? Calling the roll on adoption. Mr. Jagan.
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick. Mrs. Fry.
Yes.
Mrs. Coburn.
Yes.
Mr. Height.
Yes.
Mr. Greer.
Yes.
Mrs. Angeloff.
Yes.
And Mr. Griffin.
Yes.
Ordinance number 148, 2020, presented by Mrs. Angeloff, titled Amending Barberton Codified Ordinance, Chapter 1478, Rental Property Registration Program. An ordinance amending Section 1478.08, registration required, or ordinance number 65, 2009. Motion to adopt, Mrs. Angeloff.
Thank you, Mr. President. I move that ordinance number 148, 2020 be adopted as presented.
And Mrs. Cover.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second that motion to adopt ordinance 148, 2020.
Okay, motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff, second by Mrs. Coburn to adopt ordinance 148, 2020 as amended. Are there any remarks?
Yes.
Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just want to say that I will be supporting this after running numbers and seeing that any increase in rent over $4.11 over the past 11 years would have taken buying power away from the tenant themselves. The $60 increase would be over the 40, which is not a $10 increase on what a landlord's already paying. It's a $5. So for anyone to say that 10 would cover, has to raise 10 to cover the cost is not telling the truth there. It's $5. My final point is, after speaking with the administration, the chair, and council members, if this were to pass, then it would be time to begin work immediately on any grievances that landlords hold with the rest of the legislation and be able to move forward amicably with the city, the landlords, administration, and council. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other remarks? Mr. Gray.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm gonna piggyback on what Councilman Heidig said. We all agree that this needs to happen. We all agree that we need enforcement. We all agree that we need to follow through with this. This is the first step, and we've all stated it. I would just say it now that I'm personally going to hold each one that votes yes on this, including myself, to the fact that we agree. We all know that something needs to happen, and we all need to do something to enforce this. This cannot be an arbitrary fee increase. Something needs to come of this. So, and I fully support Mr. Heidick's text that we do need to focus on the grievances too as well. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. J.
Thank you, Mr. President. I was going to abstain from voting with this because I'm familiar with a couple of Reynolds properties in Barberton. But after talking to you and Mr. Mayor also said that we can vote for this and they don't recommend it abstaining. The reason I'm voting no is just because of enforcement. The last 11 years, I think, 10 years, 11 years, there has been nothing done. And what's going to change now? And honestly, hopefully it changes. We want it to change. But before we should proceed with this, I think we should either table it or just vote no and show the landlords that we are enforcing it and show them how we're going to enforce it. What we have right now with who we have working. And if we show them that, we'll get more support from the landlords. Because the landlords I spoke to in the past weeks, they're against it. And they all want, they don't want an increase. They say, charge us 100, charge us 200, charge us 500. But their main thing was enforcement. There's nothing been done. So if we get some kind of support from them, like we vote no right now and hold off on it, and then come back to it, if we show them that, okay, this is what we've done in 2 months that we should have done 10 years ago, maybe we'll get some more support for this topic. But for now, we'll vote no, and like other couple of council members said, they blame the council members themselves and past administration for the last 10, 11 years, why there's nothing been done. And I'm not the only one council member that said that, other council members said that also. So that's the reason I'm voting no. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mrs. Angelo.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I think we all agreed on this because we added section M, that this ordinance shall be reviewed by City Council November 2022. So I'm going to hold all of you accountable for that. November 2022, we'll have, some figures with, maybe another plan, some more changes that we have, but to put that in legislation, that is what needs to be done, and we can review that after November 2022. We can go another 2 years. We can amend this as we go, and we can do it again. So everybody remember November 2022. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Okay, calling the roll on adoption. Mrs. Fry.
Yes, I didn't motion, did I?
Mhm.
Oh, did I? Oh, okay, I'm sorry.
Mr. Greer,
Yes.
Mrs. Coleman,
Yes.
Mrs. DeBevick, Mrs. Angela,
Yes,
Mr. Griffin,
Yes.
Mr. Hyde,
Yes.
and Mr. Jake.
No.
Okay, that passes. Okay, let's see, that is the end of third reading of ordinances and resolutions. Appointments, there's one. Design Review Board, Willie Jenkins, 3-year term, January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2023. Mrs. Angel.
thank you, Mr. President. I would like to make a motion to adopt Mr. Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board for a 3-year term commencing January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2023.
Thank you. And Mrs. Coleman.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second the motion to appoint Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board.
Thank you. Motion was made by Mrs. Angeloff and second by Mrs. Stover to appoint Willie Jenkins to the Design Review Board for a 3-year term effective January 1st, 2021 through December 31st, 2023. Are there any remarks? Mr. Gregg.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. Jenkins is all around the community. However, I wanted to mention something that I seen publicly from somebody that was on a board or commission. And I want to make it clear that the city don't owe any of us anything based on a position. We don't get special treatment based on our position. Board members don't get special treatment and they shouldn't expect it. And so I just wanted to put that out there. I'm not speaking of any details, but I just wanted to make it known, my point. I was a little disappointed in what I've seen with that, but that's all I wanted to say about it.
Okay. Any other remarks? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? He's appointed. Okay, miscellaneous and unfinished business. Do I have a motion to excuse Mrs. DeBevick? Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. I'd like to make a motion to excuse Councilor Carla DeBevick tonight.
Thank you. And Mrs. Fry.
Thank you, Mr. President. I second Mr. Heidig's motion.
Thank you. Motion, all those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? She is excused. Okay, communications from the mayor.
Thank you, Mr. President. First, we're still collecting donations, non-perishables and toiletries for back in the Salvation Army. That'll last, go through the end of January. We'll pick that up again in July, Christmas in July, as we've done the last few years on continuation of the pandemic here. Also, no health board meeting this Wednesday, that's been canceled. In terms of the grass and the rental registration, I asked several weeks ago, what do you want our community to look like? What do you want the neighborhoods to look like? And, with your yes vote, or no vote, whichever way you voted, you sent a clear message to the residents, to the neighborhoods. So, when this was instituted, this has been used in good form, but we need additional resources. That was the talk when this was first initiated. So with this passage, the building department will have the necessary resources moving forward, to not only do their jobs more efficiently, more effectively, in an effective manner, but add to their team for even more coverage, i.e. enforcement. With the plan, I'll be start working on as soon as possible. I will include feedback from landlords and council. So council members for the next few weeks, few months, please give me your feedback. I'll be reaching out to you as well, including the landlords. This is I want to ensure that the input that we get from all perspectives. So the rental registration plan is already dictated in the legislation. The plan I'm putting together is an all-encompassing neighborhood redevelopment enhancement plan. So by providing these resources to the building department staff, we're gonna be able to carry this out. So, I appreciate and respect everyone's opinions, especially the emails going back and forth today. So we're gonna get started on this as soon as possible. And like I said, I'm putting something together, releasing it to council and the public, 90 days after this passes. So we'll go from there. Moving forward throughout 2021, we'll see what happens with the pandemic. Keeping tabs on that as well. But in terms of our budget, we've got a lot of work to do. So we come in here week in, week out, we talk about, council members are here, there's other avenues of generating revenue, there's other ways of doing things. But that's where the conversation starts and stops. So I need more input from council. You want to provide input, you want to have your thoughts expressed, your ideas, send them to me. Let's set up a meeting and talk. There's a lot of things that we can do, but sometimes there's things that sound good, but we can't do legally, or there's other rules or provisions on how to get things done. So it's an education. So please contact me. I wish everyone a wonderful holiday. As we close out 2020, say goodbye to it. Offer better, more positive 2021. And again, my door is always open. If you want to come in and talk and share ideas, and I know the majority of you do, I thoroughly appreciate that. So, thank you for your vote tonight on the grass and the rental registration. You sent a clear message, and we're going to get busy, and we're going to make this as positive and impactful on the Barberton community as possible. So,
Thank you. Anything from the good of the body? Mr. Hyde.
Thank you, Mr. President. With the last meeting of 2020, I just want to look at you council members here with me. And I want you all to remember where we started in January. We were a little snippy sometimes with each other. We were a little cross. We were a little, and look where we've come. We've done some good things. We've agreed. I'm just going to use the example. We shot down the CIC initially. We went back to the drawing board and we passed something that is going to be a positive thing. We've had conversations. We've had communications. And I want you to think of the last 2 months versus January and February and see what we've done. And let's continue that. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else? Mr. J.
It's been a great year. It's been my rookie year for a couple of other council members. I appreciate it. We might not all get along in council and outside council. I don't know how we react because we don't really communicate outside of council, some of us, but we're a team. So, like, I have your back, you guys have my back. We won't go outside the committee meetings and talk behind each other's backs because we're a team. We don't do that. But I still grade us as a C. I give the F to communication from city administrators and city leaders. That's an F. I mean, example was a parks director. That's huge. That's a parks director position. The chairman of the parks didn't know nothing about who the new parks director was. I sat here and asked all you guys, and nobody knew nothing. Then we had the Herald say that he knew and gave us information. Then we had the answer from the mayor that says, well, you didn't ask me. You heard me ask the whole committee. That's just one example. That's why I gave us an F for the communication. The C comes because I think A comes from Mr. Tracy. He's been a great spokesman for the city administration of City of Barberton. Without him being here, we would have an F instead of a C. So the point of it is we need to communicate better. I know Mr. Hyde is pretty pissed off that he knows who the parks director was. Are you, Mr. Hyde?
I'll be dealing with the commission personally that I was not notified
Right.
immediately.
You being a parks chairman, you should know who the new parks director is before the Herald does. Again, I'm not pointing fingers, but we need to communicate better, especially from the top. If we have bad communication from the top, we're not gonna get nowhere. With that, wish everybody a happy holiday, Merry Christmas, and a safe weekend and all that good stuff. Thank you.
Anyone else? Mr. Greer.
Thank you, Mr. President. I just want to express my concern with not having the equipment up by now.
technology grant. Councilwoman Levitt is not wrong for wanting to leave. She wrote you an email, and I know I have. And being in that industry, we couldn't have something set up in a half an hour, and I believe in my email, I said 4 days. Gives everybody like 4 days to figure out how to connect. So I just hope when we come back, whether we're here or all virtual or however it is, that we get more serious with that grant that we've spent and that make us more flexible. I did not see a reason to meet in person today. So just wanted to say that.
Okay, anyone else? Any department heads? Okay, first of all, these goodie bags are from the Parks Department. And I'll just say, happy holidays and stay safe. But nothing else, do I have a motion to adjourn? Mr. Hyde?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll make the motion that we adjourn.
Mrs. Fry?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'll second Mr. Heidig's motion to adjourn.
It was moved by Mr. Hyde and second by Mrs. Fry that we adjourn. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? We are adjourned at 7:50.